This documentary is mainly about the use of literature to further communication, specifically taking into account George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm. The use of literature to communicate ideas can be seen in both George Orwell's 1984 and in Animal Farm. Orwell uses these novels to communicate the horrible injustices done to the Russian population during the Soviet era when Stalin ruled. Essentially, what Orwell is doing is giving a voice to the voiceless. This is not the first time this has been done, and it can be seen in different novels, such as The Diary of Anne Frank and Uncle Tom's Cabin. As we all know, these books are very good at giving voices to the suppressed. I'm sure you're saying to yourself, how do Orwell's books fit into that? Aren't they fiction? To understand, you must look into the three different ways to communicate through novels. The first of these ways is through a non-fiction novel. This includes biographies and real historical retellings. This has no fictionalization in it. The second way is through legend. Legend is an exaggeration of a real story, such as tall tales. Thirdly, you have an allegory. An allegory is defined as a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. Both Animal Farm and 1984 are known as satirical allegories, a style that the author is known for. Speaking of the author, it would be good to know Orwell's past before we can properly determine the extent that his books, 1984 and Animal Farm, communicated the horrible injustices that were happening during the communist era in Russia. Like many famous authors, Orwell did not actually use his real name when he wrote. His given name is actually Eric Arthur Blair. George Orwell was just Blair's pseudonym or pen name. Blair was born and raised in London, and after he had been educated sufficiently, he went to work for the Imperial Police in a British colony called Burma. Finding that work not what he wanted to do, he moved to Paris to become a writer, where he couldn't find much work and ended up working a series of menial jobs. It was there that he wrote his first novel, Down and Out in Paris and London. Blair identified as an anarchist in the 1920s, but transitioned slowly into a socialist by the 30s. Socialism is defined as a political and economic theory of social organization which advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Essentially, the idea is that everyone works together and the community runs things. This idea is most commonly associated with the Soviet-era Russia and Joseph Stalin. Stalin used the promises of equality through socialism to sell people on his version of communism. More on him later. Blair's interest in socialism drove him to Spain, where he fought in the Spanish Civil War on the side of the Republicans against the dictator Francisco Franco. Blair fought alongside socialists in the Party for Marxist Unification, also known as POUM. A significant event happened while he was working with them. They were targeted by a Soviet-backed militia, and Blair had to flee for his life, giving him a lifetime hatred of Stalin and totalitarianism, which would lead him to write 1984 and Animal Farm both. Here we have the 5 Russian leaders that Animal Farm most closely aligns to, starting out with Tsar Nicholas II, then Karl Marx and Vladimir Lenin, after that, Leon Trotsky, and finally, Joseph Stalin. Mr. Jones the farmer in Animal Farm is Tsar Nicholas, Old Major is both Marx and Lenin, Snowball represents Trotsky, and Napoleon is Stalin. I think it would help to go over some of the similarities between the beginnings. In Animal Farm, Old Major gives a vision, and then the animals take the farm. After that, new equality laws are set, and Napoleon and Snowball take charge. On the other hand, Marx and Lenin give their vision in Russia, the people then take Russia, new equality laws are set, and Stalin and Trotsky take charge. Very similar. This is not, however, where the similarities stop, as the main plot point of Animal Farm is the rise to power of the pig Napoleon, which looks an awful lot like the rise to power of Joseph Stalin. One example of this can be seen in their enemies, with Stalin making the people hate Leon Trotsky and Napoleon making the people hate Snowball. After both enemies were exiled, they were mysteriously blamed for everything going wrong in the country to shift the blame from Napoleon and Stalin. Both Stalin and Napoleon started out on platforms of equality with rules that made everyone the same, but eventually changed the rules to fit them better and make them have more benefits. And by the end of both stories, whether it be Animal Farm or the story of Soviet Russia, the main character, Stalin and Napoleon, both turned into the very thing they swore to never be. By the end of the novel Animal Farm, all of the original rules set by the animals to keep things fair have been erased, and one rule has been put in their place. The rule reads, all animals are equal, but some animals are more equal than others. What does this mean, you may ask? This means that while all animals might seem to be equal, there are some animals that get more special treatment. The wording of this quote is very important, as it shows how Napoleon in the book and Stalin in real life made it seem like they were keeping everybody equal, when really they made a way for them to go above. This one part is actually the entire reason Orwell wrote the book at all. He wrote the book because he wanted to show the people how Stalin had made all these promises at the beginning, but had strayed from the socialist way, the way that George Orwell believed in, and made communism something much, much different. In 1984, Orwell flips over from what Stalin is to what he can become. Instead of focusing on how Stalin broke the previous rules, he focuses on the dangers of totalitarianism. The story follows a man named Winston in the country of Oceania during the year 1984. Oceania seems like no country ever made, except when we get to hear more and more about its past, it starts lining up with how communism was during the time the book was written, which was much earlier than 1984. Just like in Animal Farm, Oceania has a past where two leaders came up to power and one of them was turned against by the public and exiled, much like Napoleon and Snowball. There are two ways this government came to and held their power in the novel. The first of these being fear. I think no one could put it better but George Orwell himself in 1984. But you could not have pure love or pure lust nowadays. No emotion was pure because everything was mixed up with fear and hatred. One of the best places to find an example of this in the real world is through interviews with people who lived in the gulags. You see common words throughout: fear, shock, haunted, horrid, suffered. All of these words that really just mean pain and fear. The second way that governments are able to take over is through ignorance of the people. For this too, you turn to 1984 for the best quote. The people will not revolt. They will not look up from their screens long enough to notice what is happening. The Soviet government used both fear and ignorance. Knowing that Orwell's goal was to inform the public, you must ask, to what extent was he successful? The first way you could test this is to see how well the book sold. Both of these books are bestsellers, and to many, they are considered classics. Secondly, you could see how widespread it is. 1984 is in most schools' curriculums in high school, but I personally read Animal Farm in middle school as part of the curriculum. It is definitely widespread and taught. The only way these books may fail is in actually teaching people a lesson. As widespread as they are and as loved as they are, not enough people have taken their message to heart. We are still all full of fear, and we are still all ignorant of what is actually going on, clinging to our screen. In conclusion, although they were written